Good afternoon. How's that? Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for Avoiding the Shelf Emergency Plans at Work. My name is Susama Sealy, and I'm the chair of the IAEM Conference Committee, and it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce our speakers today. We have Amy Ramirez, who is the Risk Management Project Manager with the San Francisco Bay Area Urban Area Security Initiative. Before joining the UASI, Amy served as lead emergency planner for the San Francisco Department of Emergency Management, where she oversaw the department's emergency planning team. And we also have Edie Schafer, who is also an emergency planner for the San Francisco Department of Emergency Management, where she works to ensure appropriate emergency plans are in place to meet the city's specific threats and hazards. Edie also serves in the Emergency Operations Center as a planning section chief. Before joining the Department of Emergency Management, Edie worked as an attorney and a legal writer. Before I turn it over to our speakers, I'd just like to remind everyone, questions will need to be brought to the microphone, and there will be a dedicated question and answer session. And remember, all the lovely notes and wonderful feedback you have for us need to go into that evaluation that is in that app. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our lovely speakers.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Thank you, Susama, for the introduction and also for your 4 years as service as the conference chair. I've been to a lot of these conferences and just really appreciate everything you've put into them. So really appreciate that. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Amy Ramirez. Do people know what a UASI is? Just really, we're kind of a funding stream. We get the Homeland Security money for the San Francisco Bay Area, and then we distribute it out to the region. So just to get a sense of who is in the room today, how many of you write emergency plans for your organization? Awesome, great. How many at the federal level? All right, state? All right. How about at the local, city or county level? Great. Anyone here from a nonprofit or faith-based organization? Okay, awesome. Anyone from the private sector, universities, colleges? Cool, okay. How many of you are consultants and writing plans for other people's agencies? Okay, cool, a couple, great. Oh, nope, sorry.
No, not yet. Preview of coming attractions. So good afternoon, everyone. We're so happy to have you here with us. I am Edie Schafer. I'm an emergency planner for the city and county of San Francisco. I sometimes feel like I need to clarify that to say I don't plan the emergencies. I plan for the emergencies, just so there's no question in anyone's mind. San Francisco may differ from a number of your jurisdictions. For one thing, we are both a city and a county. And San Francisco, the city, is the only city in the county of San Francisco. Are you thoroughly confused now? No, but seriously, I feel very lucky in the sense that unlike many of you, if you're working at the county level, you may have a number of cities that you are responsible for and work with, and we don't have that, so for good or ill. Between the San Francisco Emergency Operations Center, or EOC, and our field personnel during a disaster, we have what's known as Department Operations Centers, or DOCs. And for that reason, well, the DOCs are responsible for managing their response personnel in the field during a disaster. They're also responsible for maintaining their continuity of operations. And for that reason, the plans that my office develops primarily concentrate on what needs to happen at the EOC level in order to successfully coordinate in a disaster. We also are very lucky because we have 2 full-time emergency planners in our office who are dedicated to developing and maintaining our emergency plans. And I know for a lot of departments, that's a real luxury. So we feel very lucky about that. Now, finally, we can get to this slide. Today, we want to share with you an issue that Amy and I have been dealing with for quite some time, and how we've chosen to address that issue. I realized yesterday it's been about a year since Amy and I shared a draft version of our new tsunami annex with the gentleman who was then our boss. He read the plan, at least we think he did, right? We're not really sure, but hopefully he read it. And his reaction was, you've got great material here, but it's buried. When the ding hits the fan at 0200 hours, I don't want to have to go searching through this plan to find the information that I need. I'm liable to just throw it across the room and manage on the fly. Well, as you might imagine, this was not a happy day for me or for Amy. But it became an opportunity for us to create some answers to that question that had been plaguing us, which is how do we create emergency plans that avoid the shelf, or in our case, avoid getting tossed across the room and ignored? You know, how do we create emergency plans that, yes, meet all the traditional expectations of an emergency plan, but also enable the people who need to use it to find the information they need to be successful in a disaster?
So I knew he was serious because in 2007 we had an oil spill, and I'd actually seen him toss the area contingency plan across the room because it was so cumbersome.
Yes, we definitely believed him.
So we have some slides in our slide deck that are from a photographer named Sean Clover, a series he did, Fade to 1906. You can't see them very well in this room, unfortunately, but they're also on the conference app. But basically, you're looking at a street in San Francisco, and you can't tell very well, but what's in color is what the street looks like today, and what's in black and white is what it looked like after the Great Fire of 1906, fire and earthquake. So, you know, as planners, we sometimes hear our colleagues be dismissive of emergency plans. They're basically just going to sit on the shelf collecting dust. Yes, I'm looking at some of you in the room who I know have never used an emergency plan in an actual incident. Or maybe they'll get used as a doorstop as you're evacuating your EOC. And that might be one of the reasons that emergency plans are so often recycled across jurisdictions. You just change the name of the city and then you can check the box, we have a plan. I know none of you have ever done that, right? And if you have, you did the find search and you replaced your name throughout the plan, because I have seen plans where that's not been the case. So anyone who's been in this business for any amount of time knows that emergency planning is a process, and that's probably the most important thing about developing your plans. So emergency planning is important for several reasons. So first of all, the process is your opportunity, basically, to bring together people and develop those relationships that you're going to need to successfully coordinate in an emergency. The time to, no exchange business cards, not during the disaster. Secondly, if you're doing emergency planning right, you're able to bring together, it's your opportunity to bring together a very large group of stakeholders. So, people from the private sector, nonprofits, people who are going to be impacted by the plan. And have them understand the hazard, set some objectives, and figure out the best strategies to meet those objectives. And third, as part of that process, that's when stakeholders are going to reach agreement about who is going to do what. And we know that developing that accountability is really key to being successful in an emergency. So it's not that emergency managers, like our former boss, do not value these things. We just don't think they really value the actual written plan. So Edie and I would argue that that's because plans are rarely organized to be useful in an incident. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So another reason that planning is important is because of the nature of disasters, right? When a disaster occurs, your systems are going to be compromised and overwhelmed. That's basically the definition. That's what makes the difference between an emergency and a disaster. People and resources, people in your infrastructure is going to be impacted. Your resources are not going to meet your needs. And all those things you do in your normal operations, we know, at least in San Francisco, they're not going to come close to addressing what we're going to need to do when we have a big disaster in San Francisco. So I think there's consensus that the planning process is really helpful. I think there's I mean, especially lately, I feel like this, the plans aren't that important. That really what we need to focus on is our flexibility. We hear this a lot. We need to be, creatively, we need to be able to create, we need to be creative, be good at creative improvisation. I think we heard a little bit of that in one of the speakers yesterday. And I don't, Edie and I don't disagree that, flexibility is imperative, especially with the changing dynamics of a disaster. But we really are going to have to be ready to suspend our normal ways of doing things and implement alternate procedures. And because they're going to be different, it's really a good idea if those procedures are discussed in advance, agreed upon, and written down. So by the very nature of disasters, things are going to happen that we can't anticipate. But it's going to be a lot easier to be flexible and spontaneous if we have discussed and written down the things we can anticipate. So we have a quote for you, if you don't want to take our word for it. David Alexander is a professor at the University of College London. He specializes in disaster risk, impact, and response. And he says, emergency response involves a mixture of plans, procedures, and improvisation. To some extent, the last of these is inevitable, but it needs to be limited by preparedness. The consequence of unwanted improvisation is inefficiency in emergency response, which may have serious or tragic consequences. And this is from a 2015 article that he wrote called Disaster and Emergency Planning for Preparedness, Response, and Recovery. And I really recommend it if you're trying to justify why what you do is important. He's also the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Disaster Risk and Reduction. So when our boss threatened to throw the plan across the room and manage on the fly, after we took a deep breath, because we put a lot of work into that draft, we realized after discussing it that there's at least two ways that people use emergency plans. So some people use emergency plans for planning purposes. So they provide context for your response actions. They serve as a record of the decisions regarding how we're going to respond in a disaster. They give you the analysis of your threat or hazard and your vulnerability to it. The plans might be where you go to get your scenarios when you're developing an exercise or putting on a training. And then some of us, like Edie and I, we use plans to reference when we're developing other plans. And so if you're using the plan for planning purposes, it's really helpful if the plan is written as a narrative and it follows kind of a sequential linear order. But if you're trying to use the plan in an emergency, in an actual incident, which is presumably the other reason people use emergency plans, it's really hard to find what you need, all that essential stuff like who, what, when, how, if it's all buried. So, when Edie and I show up at our EOC, we're confident. We're going to know how to find what we need in the plans because we use those plans on a daily basis. We touch them regularly. And that's not the same for the fire chiefs or the police chiefs or even our boss, former boss, when he's in the EOC, or even our current boss, when they're in the EOC as the EOC manager, for example, because they're not used to using those plans. So hopefully they've read it before the tsunami hits, but, and hopefully they've exercised on it as well, but it could be years between when the plan is developed and they've used it and when we actually have to implement it. So our challenge was really to try to figure out how to create plans that meet the needs of both users without being repetitive and ending up with a 700-page document that is really just a doorstep. And Edie's going to go into more details.
So how many of you are familiar with FEMA's Comprehensive Preparedness Guide, or CPG 101? Wow, the hands went up before I even finished. That's awesome. Well, FEMA developed CPG 101, I'm sure you all already know this, as a guide for planners at all levels, local, state, federal, in how to develop emergency plans and what they should contain. This guidance is probably the closest that we come in the United States to a standard of what should go into an emergency plan and how the planning process should be conducted. CPG 101 lays out a table of contents for what Amy and I would call a traditional plan. Traditional emergency plans begin with a section 1 that contains a scope and the purpose of the plan. It contains a situational overview that might have a hazard analysis, a vulnerability analysis, and then a list of planning assumptions, the assumptions that the planners made in creating the plan or developing the plan. So if you follow CPG 101, the information that our personnel need to know in order to successfully manage the incident is found in the concept of operations that might not begin until page 20 or 30, where you find the nuts and bolts of the who, what, when, where, and how. Traditional plans are intended to be read well in advance of a disaster, right? And therein lies the problem that we have. Our solution was to create an operational plan template. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I get so excited about it, I forget to.
Not that you can
do
even
next
see the
screen.
slides, but it's.
So our solution was to create an operational plan template that focuses on providing our EOC and our DOC personnel with the information that they need to know in a place that they can find it quickly when things go sideways. So instead of including that introductory material, the plan purpose and scope and all of the planning assumptions and all of that good stuff, important stuff, but instead of including that in section 1, we've shifted it further down in the plan, and we've added what we call the critical action guide. The critical action guide is intended to function, I'm sorry to say this, it hurts me, but like a Cliff Notes for the plan, but really that's what it is in many ways. It is intended to be a tear-away resource that our staff can take with them to the EOC or to the DOC, focused on what they need to do, what they need to know, the actions that need to get taken, the steps that need to be considered, who's responsible for those things. So it provides that step-by-step guidance on what to do and when and who's responsible, with the hope that it would be useful at ODARC 30. Now, obviously, the contents of the critical action guide will need to change depending on the type of plan, the needs of the plan that you're working on. The next few slides share elements of the critical action guide that we did for our tsunami annex after our boss kicked our butts. But we feel these elements can be adapted for use in an emergency operations plan, in a functional plan, just as well as a hazard-specific plan. So the first element I want to share with you is what we call our event coordination task list. That's a mouthful. But the task list includes critical steps or actions that are needed to successfully manage the incident. And so in this case, it's to successfully manage a tsunami incident. It includes the action or step that's needed, who's responsible for initiating it, the supporting partners who are supposed to be there helping out, taking that step, the emergency support function or ESF that's responsible for it, because our EOC is organized by emergency support functions. And then the annex section where the user can find more information about that step. And then, of course, additional resources in the plan to consult. Now, before each task list, we have a reminder, a disclaimer, if you will, for our staff to say, hey, this is a guide. Every incident is different. You will need to adapt this list depending on the specifics of the incident that you're dealing with. And that's really important. It's not set in steel. It's not set in concrete. You're going to have to use your brains. But this is a starting place for you, much like a position checklist is a starting place for us as well. Now, the tsunami annex, of course, still contains a concept of operations, right? It's later in the plan, and Amy's going to talk a little bit about how we reorganize the plan itself. And as you already know, we wrote the concept of operations and all the rest of the plan before we did the critical action guide. And we'll talk a little more about that too. But the idea is not to duplicate in the critical action guide what's in the body of the plan. The idea is to summarize it, to set it forth in a checklist form and terse, to the point, with references to where you can find more information in the body of the plan. We also included what we called, well, for the tsunami annex, an evacuation decision matrix, because that's a huge part of responding in an inundating tsunami, is how much of the city do we evacuate? Do we evacuate at all? Now, we feel the decision matrix is something that could be used in any type of plan. Whenever there's a critical decision that our leaders in the EOC or our leaders in our jurisdiction need to make, this is the place to put information that's going to give them guidance about the factors they need to consider and what have you. This matrix, I think Amy has made the point to me, she feels the matrix is especially important for hazards where it's something that the jurisdiction doesn't deal with on a regular basis. So tsunami fits that bill for San Francisco, at least I'm knocking on wood, so far, right? But if you're in a jurisdiction where you face hurricanes every year, maybe the matrix is not something you need. However, I would say that since we at least, and I'm assuming this is true for your jurisdictions as well, we have so much turnover of staff. So, you know, the leaders who are in position one year may not be the same leaders who are in position the next year. So that's my argument for, I think it's useful even in that scenario. Typically, you'll find the roles and responsibilities tables in the concept of operations. We felt it was important enough to move it to the critical action guide because we want our staff to have a quick way to find out who's responsible for this task, who do we need to talk to in the EOC or in the doc to make this happen. So we moved it to the critical action guide. And of course, I know I'm preaching to the converted, or at least I hope I am, when I say the time to decide who's responsible for these tasks is well in advance of the disaster. We don't want to be doing it during the disaster because then it is a disaster in and of itself, right? This is such an important part of the planning process, figuring out who's responsible for what and what it is that they're responsible for. Doing that work in advance is what helps us understand the resources that we'll need, the additional planning and other steps that are required in order to really implement the plan, in order to be sure also that we're writing a realistic plan, not pie in the sky, because that's not going to help anybody.
So in addition to adding the critical action guide, we also, as Edie alluded to, we reorganized the plan. This is just a sample of the table of contents. The full table of contents should be available on the conference app if you want to see it. So we moved the introduction, the purpose, the scope, description of the situation, all that planning assumptions, we moved that to section 2. So all that follows the critical action guide. We also moved the hazard and vulnerability analysis that typically is before your concept of operations. That now follows the concept of operations, and we put it all in section 4. And we did this reluctantly at first, and only because our boss insisted that we figure out a new way to organize the plan. But I think in hindsight, it really makes sense if you're trying to create a plan that actually is operational. And that really should be, your goal first and foremost of specifically, if you're writing a disaster plan for a hazard, that's pretty important. Now, to give the planning traditionalists some context and to let them know where to find things like the hazard description, history, risk assumptions, we did do, Edie added a little bit in the introduction, just a brief hazard description in the introduction, but really tried not to duplicate anything that you would find later in the plan. And then in the appendix, we put our essential elements of information, we put all of our maps, sample reentry plan, the public messaging, basically any template or element of the plan that we thought would change, so like our duty officer protocols. We put that in the appendix, and I think that's pretty standard, but in this type of plan it was really important because the critical action guide, as Edie describes it, references different parts of the plan. So we really were worried that if anything in any of those elements changed, we didn't want to have to go back and redo the critical action guide so that it matched up with the other elements of the plan. So that was really a consideration for us, is what are the things that could possibly change in this plan? All right. So to summarize and offer some tips on how to make them more useful during an incident, don't be afraid to stray from the traditional way of writing plans. Develop your table of contents for your primary plan users, especially if you're writing a disaster plan. Keep in mind what your users are going to need when they're trying to utilize this plan. Like I said, planners, people who are writing the plan, a level of familiarity that the people who are possibly using the plan are not going to have. Now, that said, if you're dealing with a type of plan like a hazard mitigation plan, do not deviate from the recommended format. If the state and FEMA has to approve that plan, just use the format they give you. But there are other types of plans that FEMA reviews, like a debris management plan. But unlike a hazard mitigation plan, that plan is going to be operationalized. So Edie right now is working on the debris management plan for San Francisco, and she'll be creating a critical action guide and organizing it in a similar fashion to how this plan is arranged. But she's going to create a plan content checklist so that the FEMA reviewers can very easily look at their list and her list and find what they need within the plan. And finally, as Edie said, if you're going to do a critical action guide, we do recommend, it actually made sense to write the concept of operations first and then go back and fill in the critical action guide.
That's true. And, I found another benefit from writing the plan in that order, and that was that the critical action guide really acted as a gap finder for me. I found it, well, let me put it this way. A lot of times when we write emergency plans, we aren't necessarily as specific as we might be about who's doing what and how they're going to do it and who's responsible for it. But you can't really do an adequate task coordination list or a decision matrix if that material is missing from the body of your plan. And so as I was trying to do the task list and the other elements of the guide, I found all the places where I hadn't been specific enough in the body of the plan. So that I felt was a really great benefit from doing the critical action guide. Amy has already talked about the fact that emergency planning is a process. We try, and I hope you do as well, to emphasize that continuum of planning in your approach. We know it's not easy. We have pressures, we feel pressures every day to write that plan quickly, get it done, check the box. But to do really useful plans that are going to work in a disaster, it takes time. It takes time. For one thing, it's so important to develop your plan with the people who have to implement it. So work with a planning team that's composed of the subject matter experts in your jurisdiction. Those are the people who have to actually put it into effect. I know everyone's heard that adage, nothing about me without me. And that's so true when you're doing an emergency plan, because there's nothing more annoying than being tasked with something in a plan that you haven't even been consulted on. Don't do that. We try not to do that. And I'm sure you all do too. We always want to remember as well that we're writing plans that we want to be used in a disaster, so we need to write in a simple way. We need to deliver that complex information as simply as possible, because we know that the people who are going to be using the plan are going to be inundated, overwhelmed, working at dark 30, where that fog of being in that incident, worrying about your own family, all of those things combined make it really hard to digest information. And so the simpler that we can make it, the better. Don't do what Amy and I did and wait to give that complete draft to your leadership, right? Share those drafts early and often. Share pieces early and often, especially if you anticipate that there are going to be issues. Get feedback from your planning partners. It's so important. And I know sometimes you've worked so hard on the plan, you feel like, God, if one more person says, why don't you have a comma here, I'm going to throw a book at them. But we have to just bite our tongues and, take out the gold that comes back, because I'm sure you all, like we, have outstanding partners, and they have so much experience that they share with us. So we want to incorporate that in the plan so that it makes it truly useful. And then, of course, we should know, sometimes we have to convince our bosses of this, that even when the plan is complete, it is not complete, right? It's never complete. Once we complete the plan, we need to train our staff on the plan. We need to exercise the plan. We need to gather the information that we get from that training and from the exercising and incorporate that information, that feedback, deal with the problems that we uncover in later versions of the plan. So the one other thing I'll mention, not really a tip, but we do have a public version of the Tsunami Annex that's available on the San Francisco Department of Emergency Management website. If you Google SFDEM and emergency plan, it'll take you right to the page where you'll actually find a number of our plans.
They're not all as good as the Tsunami Annex.
No, they're not. Thank you. I always want to call her boss. Thank you, former boss.
So now we want to hear from you guys. This is our opportunity to get ideas for what you guys have done to create plans that are actually implementable. And if any of you stand up who tell me you've never taken an emergency plan off the shelf in an incident, no, just make a comment.
But the one thing is, I think you'll have to use the mic. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so you have to use the mic.
But please don't be bashful, because we really do. We don't know it all. I mean, I know this says know it all, but it's wrong.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. I'm Kevin Sullivan from Coast Guard Pacific area. I'm not really an emergency planner. I'm much more on the response side of things. And I was out and slightly associated with Casco Busan. So I am familiar with your pain with the ACP and why it went flying across the room.
Yeah, can you do something about that for the next, because that's
I wish.
one plan that's still a mess.
What I wanted to say is, in the Coast Guard, we have a lot of background in the search and rescue world, and this is really where my experience started from, where not only the plan, which is 4 inches thick, but that was distilled for our watchstanders in the command centers that are actually running those cases into checklists and quick reference cards. And the quick reference cards, I think, are a lot like the CAGs that you guys are talking about. And those are really handy because they have some of the reference material and also some of those decision matrix type pieces. So I really like the direction you're going, and I think we have some similar progress in the Coast Guard towards those ideas. So thank you.
Great.
That's
I know
awesome.
there's also the first 96. I think there was an attempt with the first 96 response plan to try to create that summary, but we'll look for those cards as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
So LG Mills with Pacific Gas and Electric. I worked with you for El Nino and then more recently the Super Bowl and things like that. So going with plans, definitely agree. I'm a retired Marine, so we deal a lot with those quick reference guides. But empirically, in the EOCs, typically the emergency manager is usually the EOC manager. And we're expected to be the ones who know that plan from start to finish. And that EOC director, that city manager, or the mayor, and so on and so forth, are in a sense looking to us to be able to quick reference and know where this is for that. So it's been my experience when putting plans together that I have them a part of the process, like you brought up on the end of it, and then even more so, once we get to an incident or an event or something like that and it's in there, we're constantly guiding them, you know, going down the ICS checklist. Now it's time to have your meetings. This is your tactics meeting. This is your operations brief, and so on and so forth, because they don't understand that language.
Right.
They just know that they're getting the other phone calls, so we have to be there to steer them and guide them for that, and we can't really expect them to know the big old 8-inch binder.
Yeah. Sure.
But I think that plan, like you brought up at the beginning, is more for our purposes because we've gathered all those subject matter experts, because we're not the subject matter the experts, but we know how to put the plan together, and we have that information from them. And when things go wrong or something, now it's time to revamp that plan. But it's got that input, so that's what I think they're looking for us for. So that's just a discussion.
And please come to our EOC and stay there. That'd be great.
We got work to do.
How's it going? Zack Boris with University of Vermont. I'm actually also in the Air Force Command Post Controller. We love checklists, mostly because we don't want to end the world in some sort of disaster. So, but I am curious, have you tested the newest format, and what was the feedback that you received from, like, my reasoning for going to checklist is the people that spend, you know, just that one time a year in the EOC and have zero experience, and they're not doing their ICS stuff I send them. So I'm really hoping that this could be utilized for, which is the vast majority of my folks, because I'm an office of one. So have you had feedback from the sort of lay user of ICS?
So unfortunately, no, not really. We have not had a tsunami incident.
Well, the plan was only just approved by our the committee, you know, a couple months ago. So hopefully now, though, we will be able to do an exercise. When we exercised the plan in 2011, it was a nightmare. I mean, it was just a mess. Not a nightmare, but it was a mess. And so that's what really spurred us to redo it. So hopefully we will be able to put it through at least an exercise and not the real thing.
Did you at least sort of consult maybe with some of those you know, users that might be?
Oh, absolutely. We had a huge planning team for the tsunami annex, and at times that was difficult because obviously the more people that you're trying to work with, the harder it can be. But I think ultimately it was to our benefit. We had them read a number of different sections of the plan as well as the full plan when it was completed, and I just felt we got great feedback from them.
Yeah, but it wasn't until the end when our boss looked at it and he said, yeah, great stuff, but
Except for
no
that
one can
feedback.
use this. And so even though we'd involved a lot of people who we thought were the users, they all were kind of thinking about it the same way we were thinking about it, which is, oh, you need a very linear process, and you know.
Yeah, and I felt that there was some, I think when we finally let them know that what had happened with our boss and that we needed to do some reorganization, there was some resistance on the team, which sort of surprised me. But they got with, you know, they seemed to like, I got the impression that they liked the changes, and they liked the critical action guide. They liked the fact that, hey, we have a checklist now, so if it's been a year since we've read the plan, we won't have to freak out on the way to the dock or the EOC. I haven't read it since, you know, when it came out, kind of thing. So, but I hope that well, I don't hope that we have a tsunami incident, but I do hope that we are able to continue using this format and have plans that do get tested so that we can come back and share, hey, this is what worked, this is what didn't.
And we've got a whole new format for you. No, because none of that worked, actually. No.
Hi.
Hi, good afternoon. Tim Cooper, Delaware Public Health Preparedness. I'm not a planner, but I supervise the planning section, and you've echoed all their frustrations. So thank you. Great presentation. I got a free book, so I had to ask a question.
She bribed you, huh?
Hey, that's
So
good.
I do have one really good question, though. You mentioned, the 700-page plans and things that we come up with. Have you found that this new format, or are you planning on this new format leading to better teaching or training on plans? Because that's one of the struggles that we have. Once we complete the formalization process, our physician, our director signs it, is how do we get it trained to the folks that are likely to use it?
Yeah.
They've been part of the process, but these processes sometimes take 6 months to a year, and then they typically sometimes they don't read the whole thing.
Yeah, that's a huge problem for us. We're sort of separated as we're organized right now. We have planners and we have trainers and we have our exercise people. And our trainers and our exercise people are overwhelmed, as are we. And so trying to get on the calendar to do training is very difficult, and the same with exercises. So that's a conundrum we have not, I don't think we fully fixed. And the way it seems to be working right now, I haven't told you this yet, is that if I want to do training and if I want to do exercises on the tsunami annex, it's on Edie to put the training and the exercises together. And I have other plans I have to write. So if anyone has suggestions about that, I am hopeful that having the critical action guide as a source of training and exercising as well will be of use, because I think it provides us with more of a focus for the training and for the exercises, where we can actually exercise people in what parts of the plan do you need to be aware of. Remember, there's a critical action guide. It's got this and this and this, and here's where you go for other things. So we'll see. We're still in the discovery phase on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I have a question. So has anybody explored using like graphic design to try to, maybe not to make their plans more implementable, but more useful? Because that's something that I think can also be an element, and that's sort of what we were originally looking at before we thought about just doing a whole reorg. And I saw a presentation by LA County's Public Health for their aerosolized attack concept of operations for like an anthrax pod. And they had a really nice way. They had all their mission areas laid out, summarized on one page. And then they had little icons assigned to each mission area. And then when you looked in the plan, the right-hand corner of the page was the little icon for whatever that mission area was. So like fatality management was a toe tag, and so then you could easily flip to the section of the plan that had a little toe tag and know what you were supposed to do. But I think that's another big part of it, is a lot of times the plan is just so dense with words, and especially when you're trying to compress it down into a plan that doesn't seem like it's going to be intimidating, and you end up with a plan that's just all pages on the words on the pages. And so if anyone has any plans that they've done that have a really nice layout, we'd love to, please send it to us, because we're going to copy your layout because we don't have any graphic design money. So, yeah.
How about other questions? None?
All right. Okay, well, here's our contact information. Like Edie said, the full Tsunami Annex is on the website. We're going to be around. I'll be around for the rest of the day, and Edie's here, I think, just for a few more minutes before you run to get your plane. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your attention.
Thank you.
Oh.